The disappearance of the B-24D Liberator, known as Lady Be Good, isn't a story of a broken machine. It's a case study in how small navigational errors stack quietly until the map itself becomes a trap. On April 4, 1943, the aircraft departed Soluk Airfield in Libya for a bombing run on Naples. It never returned. The loss was classified as a disappearance over the Mediterranean Sea. Investigators assumed the aircraft and its crew of 9 had ditched in deep water where recovery was impossible, and that single assumption drew the search boundary for 15 years. That boundary was wrong. In May 1958, a DC-3 survey aircraft flying for the Darcy Oil Company crossed the Calancio Sand Sea deep in the Libyan Desert. The survey crew spotted a dark geometric shape on the gravel plain below, a 4-engine bomber sitting where it had no business being. It was 440 miles inland from the coast, technically impossible according to the 1943 loss reports. The coordinates were marked on survey charts, but the wreck remained unvisited for months due to the extreme remoteness of the terrain. In March 1959, a geological survey team finally reached the site and found a machine frozen in time. The arid air had slowed corrosion to a crawl. The B-24 hadn't been smashed into scrap. It looked like it had come down under control. The hull split aft of the wing, but the structure still held. The tires still firm. One .50 caliber gun was even reported to function when tested, and when the team's C-47 radio failed, the bomber's set was pulled and swapped in, working immediately. Inside the fuselage sat a capped thermos, a detail later retellings would romanticize, but the point was simpler. The desert had kept the scene intact. The preservation of the hardware deepened the mystery of the crew. No human remains were found inside the fuselage. The pilot and co-pilot seats were empty. All parachutes were missing. The hatches were open. The evidence suggested an orderly bailout rather than a crash impact. The central question shifted from what happened to the plane to where the crew believed they were when they abandoned it. The answer lies in 2 specific navigational mechanisms that distorted the crew's situational awareness. The first is the concept of the reciprocal bearing. With the aircraft's ADF reported as unreliable, the crew asked Benina near Benghazi for a direction-finding read. A single-loop antenna can show the line of a radio signal, but without clear sense information, it can be read in either direction. That creates a 180-degree ambiguity. In the cockpit, the same needle could be taken as a path home or as a path away from it, and it would look perfectly convincing either way. The second mechanism explains why the crew failed to realize the error based on time. This is the tailwind vector. The mission plan accounted for expected winds, but conditions aloft may have given them a stronger push than the crew calculated. That unmeasured velocity would have added to the aircraft's ground speed. The B-24 could cover the distance from Naples toward Africa faster than the pilot expected. When the crew scanned for the coast below, they saw only darkness and cloud cover. They assumed they were still over the open Mediterranean short of land. They were actually over the desert, still moving fast, with no visual reference to warn them. Just after 200 hours on April 5th, the fuel became critical. The pilot ordered the crew to bail out. They stepped into a black void expecting water and met stone and sand instead. With 9 men gone and the tanks running dry, the bomber rebalanced, held its trim, and glided on without them, settling toward the Earth alone. The discovery of the plane in 1958 solved the mystery of the airframe, but it created a new forensic problem. The crew had vanished into a sector of the desert that was considered unsurvivable. The search for the men would require reconstructing a decision logic that made no sense to the searchers until they understood the magnitude of the navigational error. The wreck was found, but the timeline of what happened after the bailout remained blank. The structural survival of the Lady Be Good was not a result of pilot skill. It was a consequence of aerodynamic equilibrium acting on a machine that had been abandoned. When the crew bailed out, they left the flight controls set for a stable attitude. This decision was procedural, to ensure the crew could exit safely through the open bomb bay and rear hatch without the aircraft entering a spin. The pilot adjusted the trim tabs on the control surfaces. This input created a configuration that helped keep the wings level and the attitude stable without constant manual pressure on the yoke. Once the crew departed, the aircraft entered a state known as ghost flight trim. The physics of this state are governed by positive static stability. A properly trimmed aircraft inherently seeks to return to its original airspeed and attitude if disturbed. When the engines began to fail due to fuel starvation, the thrust was lost, but the airframe did not immediately dive. Instead, the loss of airspeed caused the nose to drop slightly, which then increased speed and generated lift, raising the nose back up. The bomber entered a shallow, oscillating glide. This glide continued for 16 miles beyond the bailout point, complicated by an asymmetric flameout. 3 engines quit, while the number 4 engine on the far right wing kept coughing out power on the last dregs of fuel. The imbalance didn't throw the bomber into chaos. It simply leaned the glide into a slow, tightening turn as the aircraft settled lower, unseen. The aircraft dropped through the night until it finally met the Calancio sand sea. But it didn't strike soft dunes, it hit a hard, flat gravel pan. The bomber came in low and slid on its belly. Friction tore open the lower fuselage and snapped the fuselage behind the wing, but the low angle of the approach prevented a catastrophic breakup. The lack of fuel meant there was no post-impact fire. The B-24 came to rest largely intact. The second factor shaping the wreck's forensic state was the environment itself. The Libyan Desert is brutally dry. Where humidity would normally start eating aluminum and freezing steel in place, here there was almost no moisture to drive the chemistry. The result was a preservation lock. Investigators stepped inside and saw wiring, metal, and fittings that still looked serviceable. Some controls could be moved. Traces of fluids and lubricants still clung where they had no right to remain. The engines weren't seized. The controls weren't severed. The radio equipment looked untouched. The airframe's survival only sharpened what wasn't there. The Lady Be Good sat preserved and empty. The discovery pinned the bomber to a map, but the 9 men were still only an absence. No tracks, no bodies, no certainty. For nearly 2 years, the desert kept its second secret. In February 1960, field teams working in the area finally located the first remains. Then, in May, the U.S. Army launched a final formal recovery sweep designated Operation Climax. The objective was to close the file by locating the rest of the crew. The search area was defined by a time window of uncertain duration and a geographic canvas that exceeded the visual range of ground patrols. The search strategy relied on search grid logic. In a standard maritime search, investigators used drift modeling to predict where objects move over time. On the static gravel of the Libyan Desert, the variables are inverted. The evidence does not move, but it can be buried by shifting sand. To find the crew, the searchers had to assume a logical vector of movement. They began at the wreck and moved north, backtracking the flight path to the estimated bailout zone 16 miles away. Here, the searchers found the first physical proof of the crew's arrival on the ground. The evidence appeared as a deliberate trail built for eyes in the sky. The crew gathered stones and used them to pin down strips of parachute silk, laying the fabric into giant aeroforms across the sand. Signals meant to pull rescuers along a line. This direction confirmed the crew's navigation mindset. They were marching toward the Mediterranean Sea, believing it was a short distance away. Following this trail required a combination of aerial spotting and ground verification. The markers were spaced at intervals that suggested a disciplined march pace. By extrapolating the line created by the markers, the search team pushed deeper into the dune fields to the north. As they moved away from the stable gravel plain where the plane lay, the terrain shifted into soft sand dunes, which made walking difficult and preservation of surface marks less likely. Despite this, the trail held. Roughly 80 to 85 miles north of the bailout point, the grid finally paid off. The team found what is now designated Camp 1, 5 men together, a shelter improvised from parachutes and flight jackets. Names and roles followed from the identifiers. This was the core flight crew, pilot and co-pilot among them. However, the count was incomplete. The manifest listed 9 men. Only 5 were at Camp 1. The forensic survey of the wider area revealed the fate of the 6th man closer to the bailout zone. Lieutenant John Waravka, the bombardier, was found separate from the main group. His body was still strapped into his parachute harness, and the canopy was entangled in the casing. The evidence indicated that his parachute had failed to open properly, and he had died on impact. This discovery explained why he never joined the march. He was the only casualty of the bailout itself. The location of the remaining 3 men required extending the search grid even further north beyond Camp 1. 2 were eventually accounted for along that line of travel. The third, Sergeant Vernon Moore, remains unrecovered. While there were reports that a British desert patrol may have encountered human remains in this region in 1953, the lack of definitive identification and usable location data means his status is still technically open. The recovery at Camp 1 closed the primary loop of the investigation. It connected the plane to the men, but it introduced a new data point that contradicted standard survival tables. The distance from the bailout to Camp 1 was extraordinary. The physical cost of that effort would only be understood when investigators examined the personal effects recovered from the pockets of the flight suits. The timeline of their march was about to challenge the established limits of human physiology. The recovery of the remains at Camp 1 provided more than identification. It provided a document that forced a complete reevaluation of human performance limits in arid environments. In the pocket of Lieutenant Robert Toner's flight suit, searchers found a small pocket diary. The entries inside contradicted the standard survival tables of 1943. At the time, military doctrine estimated that a man stranded in the desert without water would lose consciousness within 48 hours and expire shortly after. The diary proved that the crew of the Lady Be Good operated as a disciplined unit for 8 days. The timeline recorded in the diary is a sequence of procedural inputs and physiological consequences. The men who made it to the ground together had almost no water, roughly half a canteen, about a pint, shared among the 8. The diary records the daily allocation of this resource. Whatever the exact sips, the effect was the same. It was never enough to hydrate. It served a psychological purpose as much as a physiological one. It maintained the structure of command and distribution even as the group's physical condition deteriorated. The decision to march rather than wait by the aircraft introduced a critical mechanism of failure defined as dehydration physiology. The human body maintains its core temperature in a hot environment primarily through evaporative cooling. When the ambient temperature rises above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the body must sweat to prevent heat stroke. This process extracts water from the blood plasma. If that water is not replaced, the blood volume decreases and becomes more viscous. This forces the heart to pump harder to move thicker blood to the extremities and the brain. In a static survival situation, the strategy is to minimize this loss by remaining motionless in shade. The crew of the Lady Be Good chose to march. This decision multiplied their metabolic heat production, requiring more sweat and accelerating the collapse of their blood volume. Despite the accelerated drain on their reserves, the men still covered nearly 80 miles before the group at Camp 1 became too weak to continue. The diary tracks the slide from soreness to blindness to the moment standing up became impossible. What survives on the page isn't drama, it's procedure, repeated until the body refused to cooperate. The story did not end at Camp 1. The forensic evidence suggests that while 5 men succumbed at this location, 3 others made a decision to push further. Sergeants Guy Shelley, Harold Ripslinger, and Vernon Moore believed they were close to the coast. They left the shelter of Camp 1 and continued north. This final extension of the march pushed the data into the realm of the theoretically impossible. The remains of Sergeant Ripslinger were found many miles beyond the rest of the group, and the trail suggested a total walk of well over 100 miles from the bailout point. In other words, the march did not end where the main group fell. It kept going into the realm of what planners once called impossible. The removal of these personal effects and the diary secured the narrative of the crew. The mystery was resolved not as a case of panic, but as a case of competent execution based on a flawed initial premise. They did everything right according to their perceived position. The tragedy was that their endurance worked against them. Every mile they walked north was a mile further into the empty quarter. The investigation had now accounted for the hardware and the men. The final phase of the Lady Be Good story would not occur for another 3 decades. It would involve a different kind of recovery, one focused not on forensic closure, but on the preservation of the machine itself. For more than 3 decades after the recovery of the crew, the B-24, identified as Serial 4124301, remained on the gravel plain. The site entered a period of stasis. The decision to leave the airframe in place was initially driven by the logistics of the Cold War. The location was remote and the military value of the hardware was zero. However, the passage of time transformed the wreckage from military debris into a historical asset. By the 1980s, the question shifted from whether the plane could be recovered to whether it should be recovered. The debate centered on the mechanism of desert preservation. This concept explains why the Lady Be Good remained in such high-fidelity condition while other war wrecks disintegrated. Aluminum corrosion is an electrochemical process. It requires an anode, a cathode, and an electrolyte. In most environments, moisture in the air serves as the electrolyte, allowing electrons to flow and oxidation to consume the metal. In the Colenso Sand Sea, the relative humidity creates a naturally sterile environment. With no electrolyte to facilitate the reaction, the aluminum formed a thin protective oxide skin and then stopped changing. The desert acted as a climate-controlled archive. However, this environmental protection had a limit. While the chemistry of the desert protected the metal from rust, it could not protect the site from human interaction. As oil exploration expanded in Libya, the site became accessible to off-road vehicles. The isolation that had protected the ghost plane was broken. Uncontrolled artifact removal began to strip the cockpit of instruments. Graffiti appeared on the fuselage. The passive preservation of the environment was being overtaken by the active degradation of vandalism. The choice was no longer between recovery and stasis, it was between recovery and gradual erasure. In 1994, the Libyan authorities authorized a definitive intervention. The operation was led by Dr. Fadel Ali Mohammed. The objective was to extract the airframe from the deep desert and move it into secure custody in the Tobruk area. This was not a military recovery, but a conservation effort. The logic was to treat the aircraft not as a machine, but as a large-scale archaeological find. The extraction required a complex logistical plan. The B-24 is 67 feet long with a 110-foot wingspan. It could not be flown out. The recovery team had to break the aircraft down into transportable sections in the field, then haul those sections north to a secure location. The process was the inverse of the assembly line that had built the bomber decades earlier. The components were strapped down and driven hundreds of miles north across the dunes and hardpack. The removal of the aircraft changed the nature of the coordinate. For 51 years, the spot on the gravel plain had been defined by the physical presence of the bomber. When the trucks departed, the site returned to being just another sector of the open desert. The shadow of the Lady Be Good was gone. The preservation of the history now depended on the custody of the aluminum in a storage yard in Tobruk. The physical link between the location of the bailout and the location of the landing was severed. The story moved from the geography of the loss to the institutional legacy of the evidence. The final phase of the aircraft's journey would involve navigating the diplomatic complexities of where these preserved sections would ultimately reside. The investigation yielded two categories of evidence: the hardware, which showed the bomber itself hadn't failed, and the physiological record, which rewrote what the institution believed about desert survival. Before Toner's diary surfaced, doctrine assumed a man without water in deep desert conditions would collapse within 48 hours and die soon after. The diary didn't argue with that table, it outlasted it. For 8 days, the crew functioned as an organized unit under progressive dehydration, rationing, marching, and recording the consequences as they went. That timeline forced instructors to recalibrate training, not around optimism, but around endurance and energy conservation, knowledge that could keep airmen moving past the second day when hope normally breaks. The physical legacy of the aircraft followed a more complex trajectory. In Tobruk, the bomber ceased to be one coherent wreck and became a set of sections, evidence broken down for custody and survival. While the majority of the airframe remains in Libya, specific components were repatriated to the United States to serve as tangible proof of the event. In the United States, recovered pieces of the Lady Be Good are held across several museums and military collections. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, is among the institutions that preserve key elements from the aircraft in their recovered state. The scars of windblown sand and sun-bleached materials serve as a material record of the environment that held the plane for half a century. However, the forensic file is not entirely closed. The recovery of 8 bodies left one open loop in the manifest. Staff Sergeant Vernon Moore remains officially unaccounted for. There is evidence to suggest his remains may have been encountered before the official search began. In 1953, a British Army desert patrol operating in the Kalancio Sand Sea reported finding human remains in the sector north of the bailout zone. At the time, the Lady Be Good had not been discovered, and the remains were not associated with a specific missing aircraft. The patrol buried the remains on site, but the location data was insufficient to relocate the grave during the 1960 search. This ambiguity means that the desert likely still holds the final member of the crew. The inability to resolve the status of Sergeant Moore is a reminder of the limits of survey technology against the scale of the terrain. The shifting dunes have a capacity to bury and reveal objects in a cycle that does not match the timeline of human investigation. The Lady Be Good is aviation archaeology at full scale, a landing mistaken for a crash, a displacement filed as a disappearance. The bomber didn't betray its crew, and the crew didn't unravel into panic. They executed a plan that made perfect sense inside a fatally wrong map. Their endurance became the trap's final cruelty, carrying them farther into emptiness with every disciplined mile. Today, the aircraft is divided between continents, the evidence cataloged and displayed, but the line they walked still defines the story. The file may be stamped closed. The ninth man is still out there, held in the silence of the sand sea.